Minutes after the hour, so I'm going to get started. We're going to go through this fairly quickly, hit the real high points on it. But during the presentation, I'll ask for questions. If you have questions and or comments during the presentation, do not hesitate to ask, and I'll ask you guys some questions. And hopefully, as like anything else, the more interactivity, if you have a question, more than likely somebody else out in the audience has the same exact question and probably has the same exact issue. So don't hesitate to ask those questions or make comments. That's what makes this at least somewhat bearable to go through these webinars. But I'll go through fairly quickly. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to stop me. So, confined spaces, you can see this is taken directly off the OSHA website. OSHA estimates that about 224,000 establishments have permit required spaces. About 7.2 production workers are employed at these establishments, and there, 2 million folks or so are entering those spaces on an annual basis. And OSHA estimates that by implementation of these programs and or processes, have the ability to save about 53 lives a year. Why confined space? And this is, I don't know if this is a confined space or a trenching incident. It could have been both, but it saves lives. It's a very, very, very dangerous process. And here's some more pictures of rescues. Whenever you're going into a confined space, we'll talk about that. There are lots of hazards. And a story that I tell, I prior to coming to Georgia, I lived in Iowa for a while. And there was a farmer in Iowa, and they'd been farming for a long period of time. So I believe that the farmer had a son, and his dad was a farmer, and his dad before him was a farmer, and they raised pigs. And the dad went into when you're raising pigs, there's got to be some place for where the waste goes. So one of the farmers, it was not full, but one of the farmer, I think the dad went into this area where there had the waste, and he was overtaken by methane gas. So the son went out to save his dad, and the son was overtaken by methane gas. And then the grandfather went to save both of them, and he was overtaken. So within that one situation, again, this is a rural area that's not necessarily under OSHA regulations, but within this one incident, 3 people were overtaken by methane gas and died in that particular situation. And so tragically, when there are confined space incidents, those incidents typically take on multiple people, because even if you are trained, even if you know not to go into that space, the first response of most people is to go in to save that additional person. And because that situation occurs, rather than saving that person, you actually increase the risk by exposing yourself, or that attendant exposes themselves, and now they have to rescue 2 people if they can. So again, this is some analysis that was done within the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they're estimating over this 10-year period between 1998 and 2000 that 98 fatalities occur per year because of confined space issues. So a lot of people are dying related to confined space incidents. So what is causing that? Why are we going into those confined spaces where we do see deaths? About 50, well, in this particular, you can see over 50% are maintenance related. You have people going in for repair, for inspection, to retrieve objects. All those are main causes of confined space entry related to death. Again, why are they dying? It's either, the vast majority is because of atmospheric conditions, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. There's other loose material, so again, we'll talk about that, but within grain processing, other material handling, people will go into a silo or other material, and they'll become entrapped and or asphyxiated within those. Again, some of the hazardous types of atmospheres: hydrogen sulfide, carbon monoxide, and other gases, kind of the big piece. Carbon monoxide, again, a very common material, and it basically, it is a poison because you can't inhale oxygen at that point in time. So the basic premise behind this orientation today is really to talk about the program. This is not training for frontline employees, and I'm going to provide you guys with training, a PowerPoint presentation you can provide to your employees on a general awareness basis. This is not training for authorized employees. This is really training for program managers, people that are going to take on the management of your confined space, permit required confined space program. And again, the acronym is PSRCS, permit required confined space is the acronym. So what is a confined space? A lot of people ask this. So it's large enough and so configured that an employee can enter bodily and perform work. So you can have a fairly small space where somebody can enter into that area and perform work. So that there might be, it might be something under the floor, it might be something in the area. Technically speaking, it could be a confined space if you can walk in there and perform work using maintenance, doing some type of welding, whatever that might be. It has limited or restricted means of exit or entry. So again, this is a little bit fuzzy, but going down a ladder, going down a hole, potentially you have to walk over a large entryway. You can't just walk in and out of there. That would be considered, you have a big lip on the door. You can't walk in and out, or you got to crawl up, or you got to crawl down. Those are things that would be limited means of entry or exit, and is not designed for continuous occupancy. So a submarine, again, you can go in there and do bodily work. It has limited means of restricted, but it's designed for continuous occupancy. So that would not be a confined space. And again, you can see remember, if you break the plane of the confined space, you have entered that confined space. So if you have an opening, you break through that plane, that is considered an entry under OSHA regulations. And as we've talked about before, we are either blessed and or cursed with not having really any OSHA oversight within local governments within Georgia. So cities and counties within Georgia do not have OSHA oversight, and but we're using that as kind of a template because I think there's some standards here that do provide some value in regards to reducing risk. So a permit required confined space has one or more of the following characteristics. So it contains a hazardous atmosphere. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. Contains a material that has potential for engulfing. So that would be grain, that might be some other material, process material, gravel, things to that effect, where you're processing material. Has an internal configuration such that the entrance could be entrapped or asphyxiated. Again, there would be potentially a vessel that has a tipped bottom, so that when you get into it, you could fall into it and you could become entrapped there, so you couldn't get out, or you might be asphyxiated by the pressure of that particular vessel. And again, contains any other serious hazards, and we'll talk about that. Some of the things that would be considered examples of permit required confined spaces, and the thing that I think that you probably deal the most with: manholes going into sewers, grain silos, trenches. Probably the manholes and the trenches are the things that you are most likely to come into contact with that would be considered permit required confined spaces. And again, non-permit required confined space is a confined space that doesn't have those hazardous situations. So, and pretty simple in regards to that. Examples of confined spaces, there's a slew of those. Again, the vast majority of things that you guys would be involved in, probably some pipe or some boilers potentially going in there, trenches, manholes, maybe some pits, not a lot of other tanks and devices. Again, coming from an industrial background, all those things, silos, tanks, hoppers, all those things that I had employees going into prior to this particular position. Again, potential or hazards in confined space, any toxic material, carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, welding fumes, corrosives, all can be a problem. If you have oxygen deficiency, you go into the space and there's not enough oxygen to survive. And as you can see, the range is from 19.5 to 23.5. And then again, as it talks about CO2, again, what that's going to do, any high concentrations of CO2 is going to really dilute the oxygen levels. And you also have mechanical hazards, crushers, electrical hazards. Those are all things associated with that. And then any engulfment. So the soil that can surround an excavation, grain in the soil, powder material in a bin. Also look at electricity, as we talked about, and again, any mechanical hazards that might be within that particular space, flammable or combustible liquids that might, again, cause an explosion or cause a fire when you're in that space. Then oxygen deficiency, and we kind of talked about that. Just from a definitions perspective, and we kind of talked about this in the previous slide, but entry is defined as the act by which a person intentionally passes through an opening into a confined space. Any part of the body passing through the opening is considered an entry. So if you have an opening in that confined space and you stick your fingers in there, that technically is considered an entry. And from an OSHA perspective, that could be considered a violation of their particular standard. IDLH is another term that you should know in regards to confined space entry, immediately dangerous to life and health. Again, any condition which poses an immediate threat to the health and life of the entrant, which causes irreversible adverse health effects, would interfere with the individual's ability to escape aided from a permit space. So those are some of the background in regards to that. And I want to get now into the policy. And before I get into the policy and talk about the required policy, really want to talk about the disclaimer. Again, this information contained in this publication was obtained from sources believed to be reliable. LGRMS makes no presentation guaranteed to the correctness or sufficiency of any information contained herein. So just legal terms that we talk about. I'm going to send you, everybody that is registered for this class, this presentation. I'm going to send you another presentation on awareness that I got off the OSHA website. I'm going to send you a couple sample programs that you can use. They're out there. Really interested, though, in then having the program elements. And that's what we're going to talk about here. These are the things that I would suggest you have within any program. One, your organization responsibilities. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. The definitions, which we kind of talked about. Risk identification, assessments, and labeling. And we're going to go through all of these in an upcoming presentation. This is actually taken from the OSHA website, and pretty much this is what they say they want to be in a written program, and it really encapsulates basically the same things I had previously in a much longer written form. But reading through this, and I'm not going to read through it, you guys can read, will tell you all the things that they'll be looking for within a program. And again, if I thought there are things that weren't valuable, I would tell you. But for the most part, within the confined space entry program, most things are fairly valuable. Now, just talk about the first one: implement necessary measures to prevent unauthorized entry. We're going to talk about the identification of this, but you also have to secure that permit required and confined space so that non-authorized employees are not entering that confined space. They need, everybody that enters and everybody that's subjected to confined spaces really needs to have some basic understanding in regards to that. And if you don't have something that requires a tool for entry, then you're allowing people. So if it's a door handle and they can just pull the door handle open, then that is not a measure. But if you have, you know, a couple bolts on there that requires a wrench or a tool to use, then that would be required. That would be something that would prevent unauthorized entry. This is, again, something I took off the OSHA website, and it's really a flow chart, a decision flow chart for permit required confined spaces. It's very good. I'm not going to kind of read through that process. I'll expect you to do that. But if you have questions, this will help you answer some questions in regards to what should you do? How do you manage this situation? Do you have should you issue a permit for entry, or is it a contractor, or is it something that can be required entered without a permit? So this is really the organization roles and responsibility. Again, within this, you can have a lot of different pieces on who's going to do what within the program, but overall, you need to identify who's going to manage that program. And I might suggest that you don't necessarily have the name of the person, but you would have the title of that person. So let's say that it's the director of public works, or it's the public works supervisor. That might be somebody that administers a program, or maybe it's the safety coordinator, or it's the HR manager. But really, their requirement is to review that program, to ensure it's updated, to ensure people are following the processes out there. So it's auditing, it's going out and checking things. And we're going to talk about that within the annual review process. But also, you're going to document the list of trained authorized employees. And again, those authorized employees and trained folks are the authorized entrants, the attendees, and the entry supervisors. The authorized entrants, as you would expect, those are the folks that are going to be going into that confined space, and they need to know the space hazards of that space, and we're going to talk about how you're able to educate them on that, how to use the personal protective equipment and training. And again, you know, there's the PowerPoint slide I'm going to send you is really for general awareness training that you would train everybody on. If you want an authorized or an attendant or a supervisor, they probably should go to a much longer class, and we'll talk about that process a little bit later. They need to know how to communicate with the attendant. They need to know exit from the permit spaces as soon as possible. Again, when they recognize symptoms, or when they're ordered out, or if there's automatic alarm. Again, they need to know how to alert the attendant when prohibited conditions exist. So again, the attendant, they need to remain outside the permit space during the entry operations unless relieved by another attendant. Again, two big issues with attendants. One, typically, sometimes they're doing something else. Their job as an attendant is to be there and be the initial rescue person if something goes wrong. So if they're doing another job at the same time, if they're not paying attention, that's the big issue. The other issue with attendants is that they have a tendency to go into that space, even though potentially they've been trained not to, even though they see their coworker, their buddy that's in that hole, that's fallen down, that has an issue. Their first instinct is go down and help that person. Again, that is something that's very difficult to train out of people, but that's something you need to really emphasize when you have a program, because if you don't do that, there's a high likelihood you potentially will have multiple issues or multiple persons involved in that incident. Again, perform non-entry rescue when specified by employer's rescue procedure, and we'll talk about a little bit about that. Again, you'd be using, if you're going down to a manhole, you may be using a tripod or some other device and harness and lanyard to be able to get them out of the space if they are had an issue. No existing and potential hazards. Maintain communication, order evacuation, know how to summon rescue, all those different things. Again, the entry supervisor doesn't necessarily have to be a supervisor, but this person probably should have a great deal of knowledge in regards to supervision, and it should be somebody different than the attendant. It should be somebody different than the attendee, and the reason for, or should be somebody different from the entrant and the attendee. And the reason for that is they're the oversight. They're the person that's going to check everybody else's work. And if you don't have that, if you have one of the entrants or the attendee acting as a supervisor, they're not going to cross-check things the way that they need to do. So they have a very, very big responsibility. Again, they don't necessarily have to maintain contact or connection with that particular area, but their role is really to provide some level of oversight upon entry into the space, to check out, to make sure you've conducted all your atmospheric testing and put all the other controls into place, and then to monitor the space periodically, and then to document the cancellation of the permit if you have completed your work in that particular space. Risk ID and assessments and or labeling, and we'll talk about this. This is not necessarily within the OSHA standard, but I would highly recommend that if you have spaces, confined spaces that your employees are going to be exposed to, meaning they're having to cross that plane or enter that confined space, that you're going to go out and do assessments prior to that. You're going to know what the limited means of entry and exit are. You're going to know what hazards they're exposed to, and the reason for that is if they're expected to enter that space prior to without having that formal assessment, they're more than likely they're more apt to make a mistake in regards to doing that assessment. So if you could do it prior to the entry, prior to even considering the entry, it's going to be a higher likelihood of having a quality assessment. So you would document and then number all of those confined spaces. So if you have 20 manholes, you might do 20 different assessments. More than likely, they'll all be similar, but it would be good to take a look in there to make sure, how do you get in and out? Is there a ladder? Is there other means for accessing that thing? In regards to a general trenching, which is not necessarily there all the time, maybe at the time before you enter that trench, you're going to conduct that assessment. Complete the assessment of each confined space and determine if it is required. Again, if there are hazards in there, if it's going to cause some IDLH, immediately dangerous to life and health, you're going to consider that to be a permit required confined space. And then labeling those things as confined spaces. So where I've come from, again, the question, how do we label manhole covers? Those are very, very difficult to label, because if you put a sticky label on them, they're just going to tear off. If you paint those, it's just going to be worn off. So what we would do is we would weld on that manhole cover. We'd weld again, just a simple confined space. We'd weld that, and then we'd weld the number associated with it, so that employees would know what space they were going to, so they could refer back to that assessment, so they wouldn't have to do the entire assessment prior to entry. This is an example of a confined space hazard evaluation survey form, and as you can see there, it's talking It actually does the piece is, can you bodily entry? Does it have limited means of entry or exit? Is it not designed for continuous occupancy? And then it talks about the hazards, and then it goes into specific pieces, looks at potential for hazards. You can find these assessments on the website. I'm going to send this one to you. It's a pretty simple one, but these assessments are throughout everywhere. Again, you need to have a risk control plan for any permit required confined space. They should have a written plan, and that can be part of that assessment process to say, what are the acceptable conditions for entry? Isolating the permit space. Again, you can also use the permit we're going to talk about a little bit. Any barriers provided, verifying acceptable entry conditions, any type of lockout or purging or flushing or ventilating the space to make sure it is safe. Again, this is the requirements for the entry permit. And again, prior to any entry into any permit required confined space, you're going to fill out, the supervisor is going to issue a permit required confined space permit. And they're going to fill out this information. As you can see, the name of the space is, after you do initial testing, they're going to put the test results. You're going to put the tester's initial and signature, and so on. And again, for your help, I provided a sample confined space entry permit, and I will send this to you. It goes through all the different controls, and this is the expectation that you're going to do this control plan prior to entering that permit required confined space. Again, 2 pages. Again, fairly standard. These are, again, throughout the internet. So once work is done, then the supervisor is going to cancel that permit. And all canceled permits need to be available, and again, under OSHA regulations, for 1 year after. And from my perspective, this is a great way for that program manager to view the success of your program. So, because if you go back and you've entered 15 different spaces and you only have permits for 3, you know that people aren't complying with this. The other piece is, let's say that something happens in the middle of the permit required the entry, you're going to void the permit. You're going to actually void it out. It's not a canceled, it's voided because of either a hazard has increased or something else has increased that made you void that particular permit. And I would keep those for at least 1 year too, so you can review those and make sure an investigation is completed for each of those voided permits. Here's a list, again, of specialized equipment. It's really based on what spaces you have, but again, you're going to have PPE, potentially even respirators, and or SCBAs that you might be requiring your entrants to have when they enter that particular space. Barriers or shields to prevent access. If you have a manhole and you want people walking into that manhole, or if you don't want people driving, you're going to put up barriers to prevent that. Blowers and ventilation, again, based on the space, based on the hazards, you might have those. Again, tripod and harness, lanyard, rescue equipment, testing and monitoring, communication. So potentially a radio if you're not going to be able to have verbal or visual communication. Lighting equipment, etc. There's a variety of different things, and what we would ask within that written program is that you document all those, and it should be based on your assessments. So based on our assessment, this is what's going to be required. They're going to have to wear gloves, they're going to have to wear a hard hat, whatever that might be, or boots that are required. You would put that within your program, and you're going to develop an inspection schedule for each piece of equipment. So harness and lanyards and tripods all have different inspection schedules, your blowers and ventilations, you're going to test those on a different level. So your testing and monitoring, your air monitors will be, you'll probably verify those prior to entry. You can do a basic test there, but then they'll ask for either a 6-month or an annual evaluation or test by a much more stringent evaluation. You can get that from an outside vendor. Again, you must have atmospheric monitoring procedures. Again, if you have hazardous conditions are detected during the entry, you got to have that process where you're, if you have, especially within entering manholes, you don't know what's going to be in a manhole. So having your air monitor being able to monitor for oxygen levels, for CO levels, for CO2 levels, for flammable gases, for hydrogen sulfide, anything that you might be exposed to. And again, within a manhole, in a city sewer, there's all kinds of potential for bad things that could occur. Emergencies. So the attendant is going to act as the first point of emergency access. So you would communicate to that person, and they would hopefully have some way to retrieve you from that confined space. But many confined spaces, you don't have that ability. So if you're entering from a street level into a manhole, having a tripod that's over where you can crank that, one person can facilitate potentially a good retrieval or rescue of that person. But it's probably more important to have an outside confined space rescue team at your disposal. Again, you guys are all blessed. More than likely, you all have fire departments associated with you. So those fire departments should be trained in confined space rescue. So prior to your entry into the confined space, they don't necessarily have to be on site, but they should at least know that you're entering the confined space. They should at least know the configuration of the confined space you're entering and be prepared at the flip of a trigger to respond and rescue that employee. So if you're going to enter a confined space, a permit required confined space, and you should call up the fire department, if that's your permit required confined space rescue team, and tell them, hey, we're going to be entering now. It's confined space here. These are the hazards. Are you going to be able to respond in a quick manner to rescue this person? And if they say, no, we don't have the manpower to do that right now, you should not enter that space. Again, the standard also requires that all rescuers be trained in first aid and CPR. These are all basic things, again, you'd find. And I would suggest it highly for your authorized entrants and your attendant and your supervisor. Again, a big part of your rescue could be your harness and retrieval lines. But having an anchor so you can pull that person out there, that's not always available. So if you're in a trench, what do you use as an anchor to pull that person out of that situation? How do you get that person out of a situation if there's an exposure of gas or something like that? Again, if there is an entrapment, meaning soil from the side, again, the question was, are you trained in how to use boxes or other things or other bracing material that will prevent that soil, or use some type of stair-step approach to prevent collapse of the trench walls? So that things you need to be very, very aware of. MSDSs, again, this is another thing that you should have from an emergency perspective. If you know that there are chemicals that are being used in there or other items, you should have the MSDSs for those particular substances. So the authorized attendant or authorized entrant, the attendant, the supervisor all know, but also the rescuers know what items or materials are being exposed to and the risks of those particular materials. Worker training, as I said previously, I'm going to send you an awareness presentation, and you can use that for all your employees. But anybody that's going to act as an attendant or an authorized entrant or a supervisor should have specialized training, and that training really should be both classroom and hands-on. You should know how to use your personal protective equipment. So if you're wearing a harness and lanyard or those devices, those should be used within that training. You should know how to use that atmospheric monitoring training. They should be trained to do that. Lighting and barriers and barricades, they should be trained how to do that equipment. Any communication process. And again, from my perspective, when I used to do this training, I would use scenarios and do this entry into an office way, and we'd pretend that was confined space, and we'd walk through that process. The more hands-on, the more likely it is. Now, we do provide confined space entry training for members, so this is something that we can provide for you. So let us know if you're interested in that. We also are working with a vendor to help provide competent person training for confined space. I would suggest somewhere between 4 and 8 hours of training for your employees that are doing this. Again, any incident reporting review. So if you have a situation where they've entered required confined space and the situations have changed and hazards have increased, that permit should be voided. You should document that. You should do an investigation, and you should review that. And then on an annual basis, the program manager should look at any permits, canceled permits, look at the voided permits. They should review training. Do we have enough people trained? Do we have the capability to come up? If you only have 2 people trained, you don't have enough people for a supervisor, attendant, and authorized entrant. So you need to look at that. Have there been any new spaces added into your environment? Have you put any new equipment, any new boilers, any new tanks, whatever that might be that you will be entering into? And then, has inspection and maintenance been completed on your equipment? Those are all things that you as a manager would be required to do. And this is just a kind of a conclusion of this is actually the awareness level training. I just put that in there. I'm not going to read through it, but I thought it would be good for you guys. This is kind of the big points of confined space awareness training. So I will ask if there's any questions or comments from people on the phone right now. Anybody have comments or questions? Well, with that being said, no comments or questions. I'm going to say you guys are all public safety or all permit required confined space program experts. And I'm going to let you guys go. If you have any questions, you can definitely pick those up and pick up the phone or send me an email. I'm going to send you all some documents, the program, some of the training materials. If you have any questions after that, please don't hesitate to call me. Thank you guys so very, very much. Have a great holiday season. Enjoy the cold weather.